Maria Vasquez had spent most of her childhood watching other people's lives from a distance. While the students at Harrington Academy rushed through the grand hallways with their designer backpacks and expensive shoes, she moved quietly through the same halls with a mop and a bucket, following her father, Louis, as he cleaned up after them. Louis had worked as the head janitor at Harrington Academy for 11 years. It was one of the most prestigious private schools in the city, a place where the children of doctors, lawyers, and executives learned to play instruments, speak French, and prepare for Ivy League futures. Louis did not belong to that world, but he showed up every single day before sunrise and stayed long after the last student left, because that job was the reason his daughter could eat, go to school, and dream. Maria was 14 years old when the story that would later spread across the city began. She attended a public school 2 neighborhoods away, but on days when school ended early, her father would bring her to Harrington so she could wait for him in a quiet corner while he finished his shift. She would sit near the old storage room at the end of the east wing, doing her homework or reading a book, careful not to be noticed by the students or the teachers. She had learned very early that being invisible was safer than being seen. But Maria had a secret that even her father did not fully understand. From the time she was 4 years old, music had lived inside her in a way that she could not explain. Their apartment had no piano, no guitar, no instrument of any kind. What they did have was an old radio that her mother had left behind when she passed away, and Maria had grown up listening to it every night before sleep. She could hear a melody once and replay it perfectly in her mind hours later. She could tap rhythms on the kitchen table that matched songs she had never been taught. She had never had a single music lesson in her life, but something inside her understood music the way some children understand language before they even know it has rules. There was a room at Harrington that she passed every week without ever entering. It was called the recital hall, and it sat at the center of the school's arts wing, quiet and mostly empty on the days when no lessons were scheduled. Inside that room stood a Steinway grand piano that the school had received as a donation from a former board member. It was polished, black, and enormous, and every time Maria walked past the open door, she felt something pull at her chest like a hand reaching in and pressing gently on her heart. She never went in, she never touched it, she only looked. One Tuesday afternoon in late October, Maria arrived at Harrington earlier than usual because her school had let out after lunch. Her father was working on the far side of the building, dealing with a leak in one of the gymnasium bathrooms, and he told her to wait near the library. She found a bench in the hallway, opened her backpack, and tried to focus on her history reading. But the building was unusually quiet that day. There were no after-school activities, no club meetings, and the students had all gone home. The hallways felt different when they were empty, less intimidating, almost peaceful. After about 20 minutes, Maria looked up from her book and realized she was sitting closer to the recital hall than she normally did. The door at the end of the corridor was open, just slightly, and she could see the edge of the piano from where she was sitting. A small lamp had been left on inside the room, casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. She sat still for a long moment, listening to the silence. Then, without fully deciding to, she stood up and walked toward the door. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The room smelled like wood polish and something older, like the inside of a library that had been closed for years. The piano sat in the center of the room on a raised platform, its surface catching the light in a way that made it look almost alive. Maria walked toward it the way a person walks toward something they are afraid to want too much. She stood in front of it for almost a full minute just looking. Then she sat down on the bench. She placed her hands on the keys without pressing them. She could feel the cool smoothness of the ivory under her fingertips, and for a moment she did nothing at all. She just sat there in that big quiet room in a school where she was nobody, with her hands resting on an instrument she had never been allowed to touch. Then something shifted inside her, the way it does when a person stops thinking and simply lets themselves feel, and she began to play. What came out of that piano was not a beginner's fumbling or a child's simple scale. What came out was a complete and fully formed melody, moving and gentle and heartbreakingly beautiful, built from years of listening and feeling and holding music inside without ever having anywhere to put it. She played for several minutes without stopping, her eyes closed, her body slightly swaying, completely unaware that she was no longer alone in the room. Standing just inside the doorway, frozen in place with a folder of sheet music pressed to her chest, was Dr. Elaine Cho, the head of Harrington Academy's music department, and one of the most respected piano teachers in the region. She had come back to the recital hall to retrieve something she had forgotten. She had not expected to find anyone inside, and she had certainly not expected what she was hearing. She stood there without saying a word, listening, and by the time the melody ended and the last note faded into the air, her eyes were filled with tears. Dr. Elaine Cho was not a woman who cried easily. She had spent over 2 decades in professional music, first as a concert pianist who had performed in cities across 3 continents, and then as an educator who had trained some of the most gifted young musicians in the country. She had heard thousands of students play over the years, from the barely competent to the genuinely talented, and she had learned to listen with a professional distance that kept her emotions out of her evaluations. Sentiment, she always told her colleagues, had no place in serious musical assessment. Skill was skill, and either a student had it or they were working toward it. That was the only honest way to teach. So when she felt tears forming at the corners of her eyes as she stood in the doorway of the recital hall that Tuesday afternoon, she was genuinely surprised by herself. She blinked them back, pressed the folder tighter against her chest, and tried to process what she had just heard. The girl at the piano had no idea she was being watched. She was sitting with her eyes closed and her head tilted slightly downward. And as the last note dissolved into the room's quiet air, she sat perfectly still, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. Then she opened her eyes, looked down at her hands, and let out a long, slow breath. It was only when Maria began to lift herself from the bench that she noticed the woman standing at the door. She startled so sharply that she nearly knocked the bench backward, and her face flushed immediately with panic. She recognized the look of the woman, the kind of composed professional authority that all the teachers at Harrington carried, and her first instinct was to apologize and run. She grabbed the edge of the piano to steady herself and started to speak, her voice coming out small and uneven, already forming the words she thought she needed to say, something about how she was sorry and she had not meant to touch anything and she would leave right now. Dr. Cho raised one hand and shook her head gently, and something in that quiet gesture stopped Maria where she stood. The woman walked into the room slowly, set her folder down on top of the upright cabinet near the wall, and pulled a chair from beside the window. She placed it a few feet from the piano bench and sat down, folding her hands in her lap, and then she looked at Maria with an expression that was calm and very serious and completely without anger. She asked Maria her name. Maria told her. She asked her which class she was in and which teacher she studied with. Maria explained, her voice still shaky, that she did not attend Harrington, that her father was the janitor, and she sometimes waited for him after her own school let out. She watched Dr. Cho's face carefully as she said it, bracing herself for the kind of reaction she had learned to expect, the slight stiffening, the polite but firm redirection toward the door. Instead, Dr. Cho nodded slowly as if the information was interesting but did not change anything important about what she had just witnessed. Then she asked the question that Maria had not been prepared for. She asked her where she had studied piano. Maria looked at her for a moment as if she was not sure she had heard correctly. Then she said that she had never studied anything, that she had never had a lesson, that she had never played a real piano before in her life. Dr. Cho was quiet for a long moment after that. She looked at the piano, then back at Maria, then at Maria's hands, which were still resting at her sides, and she asked her to sit back down. Maria hesitated. Everything in her background and her experience told her that she had already pushed far enough past the line of what was allowed. That the right thing to do was to thank this woman politely and leave the room and never come back. But there was something in Dr. Cho's voice that did not sound like a trap or a test designed to embarrass her. It sounded like genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from a person who has seen something they cannot immediately explain and needs to understand it better. So Maria sat back down on the bench. Dr. Cho asked her to play something else, anything at all, whatever came to her naturally. Maria placed her hands on the keys again, and for a few seconds she sat still, the way she had before. Then she played a second piece, different from the first in mood but equally complete. A slightly faster melody that moved through emotions the way a conversation moves through different ideas, rising in some places and pulling back in others, resolving at the end into something that felt settled and right. When she finished, she looked up at Dr. Cho and waited. The woman stood up from her chair and walked to the piano. She leaned forward slightly and played a short sequence of notes, a simple musical phrase, and then she looked at Maria and asked her to repeat it. Maria played it back without a single error. Dr. Cho played a longer phrase, more complex, with a shift in the middle that would have confused most students hearing it for the first time. Maria played it back perfectly, then, before Dr. Cho could react, played a small variation on it that took the same notes in a slightly different direction, as if she was having a conversation with the melody rather than just copying it. Dr. Cho straightened up and stood quietly for a moment with her hands at her sides. Then she picked up her folder from the cabinet, asked Maria to wait, and walked out of the room. Maria sat on the bench alone, not sure what had just happened or what she was supposed to do, listening to the sound of the woman's footsteps moving quickly down the hallway toward the administrative wing of the school. Maria sat alone in the recital hall for what felt like a very long time. The small lamp on the side table continued to cast its warm light across the floor, and the room remained perfectly quiet around her. She thought about leaving. The practical side of her mind, the part that had been trained by years of understanding exactly where she belonged and where she did not, kept nudging her toward the door. She had already done something unusual by entering the room in the first place. And now she had played the school's piano without permission and caused a teacher to walk away with a folder and a serious expression. And none of that felt like it was going to end well for her father. That thought, her father, was the one that made her stomach tighten the most. Luis Vasquez had spent 11 years building a quiet and respectful relationship with Harrington Academy. He was not the kind of man who made trouble or drew attention to himself. He came to work early, he did his job carefully, he greeted the staff with courtesy, and he left without complaint. His reputation at that school was something he had constructed slowly and deliberately over more than a decade. And Maria understood, without anyone ever saying it directly, that his job security depended in part on the family staying invisible. She was not supposed to be sitting at a Steinway grand piano in the school's recital hall. She was supposed to be on a bench in the hallway reading her history textbook. She had almost made up her mind to go when she heard footsteps returning, and not just one set. There were at least two people walking toward the room, and the pace was brisk and purposeful. Maria straightened on the bench and pressed her hands together in her lap and waited. Dr. Cho came through the door first, and behind her was a man Maria had seen before from a distance but had never spoken to. He was tall with silver hair and wore a dark blazer over a pale blue shirt, and he carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that came from being in charge of something for a long time. His name was Dr. Frederick Hale, and he was the principal of Harrington Academy. Maria recognized him from the framed photograph that hung near the school's front entrance, and seeing him walk into the room made her feel a cold and immediate certainty that she was in serious trouble. But Dr. Hale did not look angry. He looked curious in the same careful way that Dr. Cho had looked curious, like a person who had been told something surprising and had come to see for themselves whether it was true. He nodded at Maria when he entered, a small and neutral acknowledgement, and then he looked at the piano and then back at her, and he said good afternoon in a tone that was polite and completely even. Dr. Cho explained to him quietly, as if Maria was not in the room, that this was the young woman she had told him about, that her father worked at the school, and that what she had heard from the hallway had prompted her to come and find him immediately. Dr. Hale listened without interrupting. Then he looked at Maria directly and asked her in a straightforward and unhurried way if she would be willing to play something for him. Maria looked at Dr. Cho, who gave her a small nod that felt reassuring without being dramatic, and then she turned back to the piano. She was nervous in a way she had not been the first time she played, because the first time there had been no audience and no stakes, and she had simply let herself feel the music the way she always did inside her own mind. Now there were two adults watching her with focused attention, and the weight of that attention sat on her shoulders like something physical. She placed her hands on the keys and tried to find the same quiet place inside herself that she had found before. It took a moment longer this time, but she found it. She began to play, and within a few bars the nervousness began to loosen its grip, because the music was stronger than the anxiety it always had been, and once she was inside it, the outside world became secondary. She played for close to 4 minutes. And the piece that came out of her hands that afternoon was the most complete and emotionally layered thing she had produced yet. As if the presence of an audience had not diminished her, but had somehow drawn something deeper out of her without her meaning it to. When she finished, the room was very still. Dr. Hale stood with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, and he stayed in that position for several seconds after the music ended. Then he uncrossed his arms and turned to Dr. Cho, and they exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation in it, the kind of silent communication between colleagues who have worked together long enough to understand each other without words. Dr. Cho gave a single small nod, and Dr. Hale turned back to Maria. He asked her again to confirm that she had never received any formal instruction. Maria said yes, that was correct. He asked if she could read sheet music. She said she did not know what sheet music looked like up close, only that it existed. He asked if anyone in her family played an instrument. She told him that her mother had loved music but had never played anything, and that her father sang quietly to himself sometimes when he thought no one was listening, but that was all. Dr. Hale was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said that he would like to speak with her father before the end of the day, and that if she was comfortable with that, she should let Louis know that the principal's office would like to see them both together as soon as his shift allowed. His tone was respectful and direct, and he spoke to her as if she was someone whose comfort in the situation mattered, which was not something Maria had expected from a man in his position talking to a janitor's daughter who had wandered into a room she had no formal right to enter. After both adults left the room, Maria sat for another minute on the bench. She was not sure what had just been set in motion, but she could feel that something had shifted, the way the air feels different just before a storm arrives, charged and expectant and impossible to ignore. She picked up her backpack, stood up from the piano, and went to find her father. Luis Vasquez was still in the gymnasium hallway when Maria found him, coiling a length of rubber tubing that had been part of the repair job he had spent the afternoon completing. He was wearing his gray work uniform and his old steel-toed boots, and there was a smudge of grease along the side of his right hand that he had not bothered to wipe away yet. He looked up when he heard Maria's footsteps and gave her the easy, familiar smile he always gave her when she appeared at the end of his workday. The smile that said he was tired but glad she was there. The smile faded slightly as she got closer, because he could read her face the way only a parent can read a child's face, picking up signals that were invisible to everyone else. He could see that something had happened. He asked her quietly if she was all right, and she said yes. And then she told him, as calmly and clearly as she could manage, everything that had occurred in the recital hall that afternoon. She told him about sitting at the piano, about playing, about Dr. Cho appearing in the doorway, about being asked to play again, about Dr. Hale coming into the room and listening, and about the request that they both come to the principal's office before the end of the day. Louis did not speak while she talked. He held the rubber tubing in his hands and looked at his daughter and listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and Maria could see him working through what she had told him, processing it the way he processed everything, slowly and carefully and without rushing toward a reaction. Then he looked down at his hands, saw the grease smudge, and excused himself to go wash up. He came back 2 minutes later with clean hands and his work jacket straightened, and he told Maria to walk with him to the principal's office. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it actually was. Maria matched her father's pace, which was measured and unhurried, the walk of a man who had learned that arriving somewhere calmly was better than arriving out of breath. She noticed that he held his head up as they walked, not in an aggressive way, but in the way of a person who understood that how you carried yourself said something about who you were. And Louis had always been very deliberate about who he was. Dr. Hale's assistant was still at her desk when they arrived, and she told them that Dr. Hale was expecting them and to go right in. The office was large and well lit, with bookshelves along one wall and a wide wooden desk at the center. Dr. Cho was already seated in one of the chairs arranged in front of the desk, and Dr. Hale stood when Louis and Maria entered, which was a gesture that Louis noticed immediately and that Maria could tell her father had not expected. Dr. Hale shook Louis's hand and thanked him for coming, and then he gestured for them both to sit. He did not open with small talk or build slowly toward the point. He said directly that his music director had brought something extraordinary to his attention that afternoon, and that he wanted to have an honest conversation with them about it. He described what Dr. Cho had told him and what he himself had witnessed in the recital hall, and he said that in his 20 years of working in music education, he had rarely encountered what he believed he had heard Maria demonstrate that day. Louis listened with his hands folded in his lap and his expression attentive and careful. He glanced once at Maria during Dr. Hale's description of her playing, a brief sideways glance that carried more emotion than his face was showing, and then he looked back at the principal and continued to listen. Dr. Cho spoke next. She explained that what set Maria apart was not simply that she could play without training, because occasionally children picked up basic melodies by ear, and that alone was not remarkable. What was remarkable was the structural completeness of what Maria played, the way her melodies had internal logic, emotional arc, and resolution, qualities that most trained students spent years learning to build deliberately. She said that Maria appeared to have an innate understanding of musical architecture that she had never encountered at this level in an untrained student, and that it would be, in her professional opinion, a serious waste to leave it unaddressed. Louis asked a simple and direct question. He asked what they were proposing. Dr. Hale leaned forward slightly and said that Harrington Academy had a small number of full scholarship positions reserved for exceptionally gifted students who could not otherwise access the school's programs. These scholarships covered tuition, materials, and instrument access, and they were awarded based entirely on demonstrated ability rather than financial background. He said that after what Dr. Cho had reported and what he had personally witnessed, he wanted to formally invite Maria to audition for one of those positions. The room was quiet after he said it. Maria felt something move through her that she did not have a word for at the time, a feeling that was part disbelief and part a recognition so deep it almost hurt, like hearing a sound you had been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. She looked at her father. Louis was looking at Dr. Hale with an expression that was composed and measured, but his jaw had tightened slightly in the way it did when he was managing something large inside himself. He asked about the audition process, what it involved, and when it would take place. Dr. Hale said that Dr. Cho would handle all the details, that the process was straightforward, and that given what had already been observed informally, the audition was more of a formality than a gatekeeping exercise. He was not making promises, he said, but he wanted to be transparent that the interest from the school's side was genuine. Louis nodded slowly. He looked at Maria once more, and this time the glance lasted a little longer, and in it Maria saw something she had not seen on her father's face in a very long time. It was not quite happiness, because it was too large and too unsteady to be called something as simple as happiness. It was closer to the look of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had just been told, for the first time, that he did not have to carry it alone anymore. He thanked Dr. Hale and Dr. Cho for their time and told them that he and Maria would discuss it at home and be in touch. He stood, shook both their hands again, and walked out of the office with his daughter beside him. They did not speak until they reached the parking lot, and when they did, it was Louis who spoke first. He stopped walking, turned to face Maria, and looked at her for a long moment in the fading afternoon light. Then he put both hands on her shoulders and said, in a voice that was quiet and slightly rough at the edges, that her mother would have loved to hear her play. Maria said nothing. She wrapped her arms around her father's waist and held on, and Louis stood there in the Harrington Academy parking lot with his arms around his daughter. And for the first time in a very long while, neither of them was invisible. The audition took place on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, in the same recital hall where everything had begun. Dr. Cho had spent the intervening weeks communicating with Maria through a series of brief and practical emails, outlining what the audition panel would expect and what Maria should prepare. The guidance was gentle but honest. The panel would consist of 3 members of Harrington's music faculty, and while Dr. Cho had already shared her own assessment with her colleagues, each panel member would form their own independent judgment. Maria should come prepared to play 2 pieces of her own choosing and to respond to some short musical prompts given by the panel in real time. There was no sheet music requirement. The audition would be evaluated on the basis of what Maria could actually do, not on what she had been formally taught to do. Maria spent those 3 weeks doing something she had never done before in a structured way. She practiced. Without a piano at home, she worked with what she had, tapping rhythms on the kitchen table, humming melodies into a small notebook she had bought with her lunch money, writing down in her own invented notation system the shapes of the pieces she was building in her mind. Louis, who did not fully understand what she was writing but understood that it mattered, made sure the apartment was quiet in the evenings so she could concentrate. He told his neighbors downstairs that his daughter was preparing for something important and asked if they could keep the television lower after 8. And they agreed without asking questions because Louis was the kind of neighbor people were glad to help. On the Friday evening before the audition, Dr. Cho had arranged for Maria to have 1 hour alone in the recital hall to familiarize herself with the piano again and settle her nerves. Maria sat at the Steinway for the full hour, not running through her pieces mechanically the way a nervous student might repeat something until it lost all feeling, but simply playing, letting her hands move and her mind stay open, revisiting the melodies she had chosen and letting them breathe. When the hour was over, she sat quietly for a few minutes with her hands in her lap, and then she turned off the lamp, picked up her backpack and went home. She slept better that night than she had expected to. The following morning she arrived at Harrington with her father, who had put on his good shirt and his dark trousers, the clothes he wore to church and to parent evenings at Maria's school. He sat in the hallway outside the recital hall on the same bench where Maria used to wait for him during his shifts, and he held his hands loosely together and looked straight ahead and did not try to fill the silence with reassurance, because he knew his daughter well enough to know that she did not need words from him right now. She needed to know he was there, and that was enough. The 3 panel members were already inside when Maria entered. She recognized Dr. Cho, who gave her a small professional nod from her seat at the side of the room. The other 2 were a man named Mr. Acoffer, who taught advanced composition at Harrington and had a reputation among the students for being exacting and sparing with praise, and a woman named Dr. Reyes, who was an external assessor brought in from the city's conservatory to ensure the evaluation was independent and rigorous. Neither of them smiled when Maria entered, but neither of them looked unfriendly. They looked like people whose job it was to listen carefully, and they intended to do exactly that. Maria sat at the piano, arranged herself on the bench the way she had taught herself to sit over the past weeks, with her back straight and her feet flat and her hands relaxed at her sides before she brought them to the keys. She looked at the panel for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at the piano and then she began. Her first piece was the melody she had been building since the day she first walked into the recital hall, the one that had started as something wordless and private, and had grown in the weeks since into something fuller and more considered. It opened quietly and gathered itself slowly, the way a story gathers before it reaches the part that changes everything. And it moved through several emotional registers before arriving at an ending that felt both inevitable and surprising at the same time. When she finished it, the room held its silence for a moment before she moved into her second piece, which was shorter and more direct. A melody built around a repeating pattern that shifted each time it returned, like a familiar face seen in different kinds of light. When both pieces were done, Mr. Okafor leaned forward and played a short sequence of notes on the small keyboard he had brought with him for the prompt portion of the evaluation. He asked Maria to respond to it however felt natural to her. She listened, waited a moment, and then responded at the Steinway, not by copying what he had played, but by answering it the way one voice answers another in a conversation, building on the emotional content of his phrase and carrying it somewhere new. Mr. Okafor sat back. He played another prompt, longer and more harmonically complex. Maria answered that one too, and this time she took his phrase in a direction that made Dr. Reyes, who had been sitting with her pen poised over her evaluation sheet, set the pen down on her knee and simply listened. The prompt portion continued for another 10 minutes. By the end of it, the exchange between Mr. Okafor and Maria had begun to feel less like an audition and more like a genuine musical dialogue between two people who happened to be operating at very different points in their formal training, but who were speaking the same language fluently. When it was over, the three panel members exchanged a few quiet words among themselves while Maria sat at the piano and waited. Dr. Cho did not participate in those words because she had already declared her position, but she sat with her hands folded and her expression composed, and she watched the other two reach whatever conclusion they were reaching. Mr. Okafor spoke first. He looked at Maria and told her that in 30 years of teaching music he had encountered raw talent many times, but that what she had demonstrated was not simply raw talent. Raw talent was common enough if you looked for it. What was uncommon was the combination of instinct, emotional intelligence, and structural intuition that she had shown. And that combination, in his experience, was what separated musicians who could play from musicians who could genuinely communicate. He said she had it, and that it would be a professional failing on his part not to say so clearly. Dr. Reyes said that her formal recommendation to the scholarship committee would reflect everything she had heard that morning, and that she saw no reason to qualify or soften that recommendation. Dr. Cho told Maria that she would receive the official decision by letter within 5 business days, but that she hoped Maria would begin thinking about what she wanted to learn first, because there was a great deal ahead of her and they should not waste any time getting started. Maria walked out of the recital hall and into the hallway where her father was waiting. Louis stood up from the bench the moment he saw her face, because her face told him everything before she said a word. She crossed the hallway and told him quietly that she thought it had gone well. And Louis nodded once and pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way people do when they are trying to keep their composure in a public place. Then he looked back at his daughter and said that he had always known, even when he had no way to prove it and no language to describe it, that she carried something inside her that the world had not yet seen. The letter arrived 4 days later. Maria was offered a full scholarship to Harrington Academy beginning the following semester, with placement in Dr. Cho's advanced music program and access to the recital hall during designated practice hours. Louis read the letter at the kitchen table 3 times before he set it down. Then he got up, went to the small shelf above the television where he kept a photograph of his wife taken the year before Maria was born, and he stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything. Maria went on to study at Harrington for 3 years. Under Dr. Cho's guidance, she learned theory, composition, and classical technique, and she absorbed formal training the way dry ground absorbs rain, quickly and completely, and with an urgency that came from knowing how long she had waited without knowing she was waiting. She competed in regional music festivals and won. She performed at the school's annual recital in her 2nd year and received a standing ovation from an audience that included several people who had no idea that the girl at the piano was the janitor's daughter, and several who did and found that it made the music more beautiful rather than less. By the time Maria was 17, she had been accepted into a summer intensive at one of the country's leading music conservatories, with a recommendation letter written personally by Dr. Elaine Cho, who described her in that letter as the most naturally gifted student she had encountered in her career. A student who had walked into a room with no training and no instrument and no formal opportunity, and had sat down at a piano and played as if the music had simply been waiting inside her all along for somewhere to go. Louis continued working at Harrington Academy for 2 more years after Maria's scholarship began. He mopped the same floors, repaired the same fixtures, and greeted the same staff with the same quiet courtesy he always had. But something was different now, and the people who worked alongside him could feel it without being able to name it precisely. He carried himself with the same steadiness as always, but underneath it there was something lighter, something that had not been there before, a man who had given everything he had to a life built around his daughter's future, and had lived long enough to see that future begin to arrive. He still sang quietly to himself sometimes when he thought no one was listening. But now, occasionally, Maria's melodies found their way into what he sang, and he did not always realize he was doing it, and that was the most honest kind of tribute there was.